There is a very strong prescription in the economic survey. Very rarely do you see government advisors use language like get out of the way, that business as usual carries a high risk of economic growth stagnation, if not economic stagnation, critiquing the role of government agencies, asking for trust to be created, and really laying a roadmap for what the finance minister ought to be doing. But is the government listening? Is this just academics speaking and the government dealing in a more political spectrum, or is this at some level an indication of the thinking within the government? On China, we saw last year what was said in the economic survey later manifested in terms of a change in economic policy with Beijing. So are we picking up signs of what the government is potentially thinking at this time? Joining us on this broadcast, I want to welcome Sajid Chinoy, Head of Asia Economic Research, Dr. Samiran Chakrabarti, Managing Director, Chief Economist at Citibank, Pranjal Bhandari is the Chief India Economist at HSBC, and I have Professor Arun Kumar. He's been a Professor of Economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. What I want to do right now is give you a sense of the data put out by C-Voter, which is really the expectations of the Aam Aadmi, the voters, the citizens, about the budget and their sense of how the economy is doing. And this really is quite alarming, frankly. The question was, has the quality of life of the common man improved in the last 1 year? The green line indicates those who think it's improved. That's now come down to 25%. Now you will see next those who think that their life is around the same, and then in red you will see those who've deteriorated. So around the same is roughly the same as the last few years, but look out for that red marker, which will show you the number of people who think their lives have deteriorated. Now remember, the last time you saw really big numbers was in 2013, right before the time there was a government change in the general elections. Since then, the numbers were moderate, but between the last 2 years, the percentage of those who think their lives has deteriorated has actually gone up now to 41%. That's not all. I'll show you a couple of more data points which give you a sense of how the Aam Aadmi feels about the current economic outlook and what he thinks may happen to him over the next 1 year. So this is about the last 1 year. Let's now move to the next slide, which looks at how citizens think their economic condition is likely to be over the next 1 year. Now here, those who think their lives will improve. Soon after the new government was formed, that was very high, mid-70s. It stayed high all the way through the first term of the Modi government. Now it's crashed to less than half of what it was when the government came into power. Those who think their lives will roughly stay the same, that's the blue line coming up on your screen, and that is a plateauing line. 35% in 21, 33% now, so that's a plateauing line. But look at the red line, which is really the most worrying, which is about those who think their lives are likely to deteriorate. Here, if you see, the percentage of those who think their lives are likely to deteriorate are more than those who seem optimistic or ambivalent about their condition. That's now up at 37%. Earlier, there were fewer people who were pessimistic and more who were optimistic or ambivalent. Now that's changed. It is inflation which seems to be causing the greatest worry. Let me show you the outlook on inflation and the outlook on household finances. So opinion on inflation, those who think prices have gone down has come down to 24%. That's the green line on your screen. You see it's actually coming down. Those who think prices have gone up. Now look at this red line, which in 2020 was at 76%. Those who think prices have gone up between the last year and now, there's an increase and that curve goes upwards to 64%. Those who think prices have kind of remained the same, that's the blue line coming up on your screen. Again, that line is plateauing at just 12%. So very few people think prices are the same. Those who think prices are going up is now at 64%. I'll show you one more data slide on your screen right now. This is a very quick sense of how viewers, voters are assessing the state of the economy. This is data by C-Voter put out for India today. Is inflation having an adverse impact on your life? Those who think it's getting unmanageable now stands at 51%. This was at a low of 25% in 2017. From there, it's more than doubled to 51% now. Those who think that, yeah, inflation will have some kind of an impact, but not much, that number is actually coming down. That percentage from 41 in 21 has now slipped to 29. Those who think that there is no impact at all, that there's no impact, is actually now a very low 20%. So outlook on growth, outlook on inflation, and there'll be a few more slides we'll have out during this broadcast, doesn't seem very good. So I want to go across to Sajid Chinoy. Sajid, typically the middle class and those who get surveyed in such polls have been bullish about their prospects under the Modi government. This data seems to suggest, for once, that middle class is now feeling the pinch, and their prognosis of their own economic fortunes doesn't seem very bright.
Rahul, two quick observations. One is you've noticed many of these lines actually began to inflect after the pandemic. Okay. And B, you're seeing similar results around the world when it comes to inflation, right? So around the world, you've seen that there's a perception of a cost of living crisis. And the disconnect here is, economists and policymakers look at inflation rates, what used to be 6% is now 5% or 4%. But common people look at price levels. And when you get 5 or 6% inflation year after year, over a 4 or 5 year period, you see a 30-40% increase in the price level. Now, one other point is when the economy is doing very well, and you have higher inflation, but good job prospects, it's more tolerable. What we've seen since the pandemic is repeated supply shocks. Right? It was first from the pandemic, then from the Russia-Ukraine war. In India's case, it's been elevated food inflation. So one can empathize with this. The good news, I think, is finally we've begun to see food prices roll over. I think after a long time, expect to see headline inflation in the 4% handle for the next 6 months. So I think that's the first part of the puzzle. But the second thing, and this is the last thing I'll say, is that, for countries like India, employment is also crucial to absorb the effects of higher prices. And I think one thing that you saw the economic survey hint at is growth in India needs to become more labor intensive. And I know we'll have a bigger discussion on that. So I think both parts of the engine need to work, that you need to ensure that growth is more labor intensive to create jobs. And hopefully these series of supply shocks is behind us and there's some relief for people. But these numbers that you showed are very similar in many countries around the world post-pandemic.
Sure, it is. But this government naturally, Samir and Chakravarti, worried largely about how their voters, their citizens view their own economic fortunes. And if I were Finance Minister or Prime Minister's office looking at these numbers, how concerned would you be about the fact that people are not very optimistic about their economic fortunes and they see the budget potentially as one policy opportunity to try and spread some cheer and bolster their prognosis or their outlook on the economy?
So Rahul, if I want to glean something out of the economic survey to give an answer to your question, I think that will be twofold. The first is that the economic survey, I don't think goes into any explicit demand side fiscal stimulus at all. It talks more about addressing the supply side issue. So from that extent, it is difficult to expect that the budget will be very stimulative. We are all expecting that the fiscal deficit will come down. But even within that backdrop, there is a possibility that we get small tweaks in the income tax, etc. We think that about a 0.1% of GDP space is there for income tax reduction. That could give a bit of a cheer to the consumer. So that's one part of it. The other part is that it is, as Sajid was also mentioning, expected that inflation rates have peaked. And from here on, we are going to have an extended period of cooling off inflation. We can make sure that that stays longer by doing, again, all the supply side right steps on agriculture. If we get that, then with a lag, we'll probably see all these charts that you were showing. Their trend lines will also change. We need a good period of this inflation to moderate on a sustained basis.
Pranjal Bhandari, when the chief economic advisor says business as usual carries a high risk of economic growth stagnation, if not economic stagnation, the message is the government must get out of the way, allow business to focus on their core mission. That's rolling. This means rolling back regulations significantly. Now, that's very strong language. Does it, to your mind, reflect the urgency of the situation and the dire straits the CEA thinks the economy could be in if the government doesn't act? Or is it really just an academic's prescription and the budget will be made more in the political world?
So Rahul, let's just take a step back all the charts that you showed just basically just screamed out one thing to me, which I've been saying for a while now, that there are two Indias at play. One is what I call the new India, and the other is the old India. The new India is high tech. It's been growing at 15% per year. It's got all the high tech things like mobile phone manufacturing, digital startups, but it only employs 5% of the people. And then you have the old India, which employs a lot more of the people, is 85% of the economy, is agriculture, small firms, and hasn't been growing as well. It's been growing at about 5.5% or so. And I think this is really the crux of the matter, that it's good, it's great that high-tech India is growing very well, but you also want the mid-tech India to start to participate in this whole growth journey. Now, how does mid-tech India participate? I think there's a lot we can get from raising ourselves in labor-intensive sectors like textiles, footwear. These are very jobs-intensive, but they need a lot of deregulation. You need the government to go out of the way. You need private sector to really unleash their energy. You do need the government to do a few things like, for example, not raise import tariffs too much, simplify taxation. But at the end of the day, you need them to be out of the way once some initial cleanup is done. And I think this is exactly what the chief economic advisor, in my view, had in mind, that how do you unleash the entire mid-tech and basically old India and get them to grow the way high-tech has been growing for the last couple of years.
Professor Arun Kumar, when you look at the data that I played out from Seawater, is there a sense of deja vu that this is what you've been saying for a while, now being captured very clearly by these numbers? What's your reading of the mood of the economy as far as the Seawater data for PSE is concerned?
So, Rahul, the first thing is that very often in the last 40 years that I've analyzed the budget and the economic survey, I find what the economic survey says the budget doesn't necessarily follow. So therefore, we can't really depend on what the economic survey is saying. Coming to your data, I agree with Pranjal that, there are really two Indias, and I'd categorize them as organized and unorganized. Not just high tech and low tech, but organized and unorganized. This K shape is what is reflected, because unorganized is almost 94% of the employment, and their prospects have been going down, and that's why I think the mood has actually deteriorated. They are the ones who get affected by inflation, and I agree with Sajid that it's really prices for them. I've been writing this for the last many years, that rate of inflation coming down doesn't mean that prices are coming down. Prices are still going up. And the unorganized sector, by definition, is not able to get its wages increased. Now, coming further, what I see is that the economic survey doesn't have an overall macro perspective. There are a lot of contradictions in it. For instance, take the environment issue. What they are saying is not reducing consumption, which is actually driving the consumerism that's driving the environmental degradation. They're only talking about more EVs, etc. These have to be sorted out. Similarly, in the period 2004 to 2009, we had a high rate of growth in spite of all the regulation that was there. So regulation is not really the issue. The issue really is demand. For the organized sector also, demand is petered out.
So let's spend some time, Sajid, on that, because in a lot of the earning calls...
Rahul, let me just complete for a moment. Let me just complete. Also, the issue is that I think this, positivity on the price front, supply shock is, somewhat misplaced. Given Mr. Trump has come, he's talking about, raising tariffs. That's going to impact prices all over the world. That's going to, impact supply chains. And therefore, inflation is not necessarily going to come down very soon, given what Mr. Trump is promising. So I think we have to really worry about some of these things. They're not going to be as easy. It's not just an internal thing on which we have control. They're coming from the external sector. And therefore, we have to sort out our internal problems, because we cannot sort out the external problem.
Sajid Chinoy, a lot of the earning calls, when the last quarterly earnings happened by the FMCG majors, spoke of slackening urban demand, and that there was a lot of talk in earlier years about rural consumption being low and what needed to be done to spur that. What do you think, how real do you see that as being a problem? What do you think Finance Minister Sitharaman should be doing to try and spur urban demand?
Well, it's clearly, this is something I've been saying for the last few years now, that the binding constraint on private investment is no longer supply. It's not balance sheets, right? It's not deleveraging. That process has played out. It's really demand visibility. And the bar for demand visibility has only gone up given the global environment, given the massive amount of excess capacity in China that's flooding into all markets, including India. Indian entrepreneurs need to see more demand visibility to invest. Now, the question is, where does that come from? And I think this is where there were some really important recommendations from the in the survey, because consumption in the medium term is a function of income, and income is a function of employment. So the real question is, what can India do to boost employment? And I come back to what I said in the beginning, that either growth rates have to go up from 6.5 to 7.5, or for any level of growth, it has to become more labor intensive. For every unit of output, we need more people and fewer machines. Now that requires a full 360 approach. Some of that was in the survey. You have to do much more education and skilling to make labor more employable. If we're going to be doing industrial policy, we should be focused on labor intensive sectors. What the survey said is, if you have this big push in deregulation and India becomes a more competitive destination to produce in, then you will see multinational firms come here, and that generates export demand. So this is not a trivial ask. This is an issue we've been facing for 2 decades, but the focus has to be on the demand side and supply side. How do we make our growth more labor intensive? It's when you get that employment certainty that we will get consumption certainty. When you get the consumption certainty, you will get private investment, and then you get into a virtuous cycle. One last thing I'll say, Rahul, there's so much clamor on a fiscal stimulus this year. We have to understand the macro math here. That fiscal deficits are coming down. They have to come down given where public debt is. When fiscal deficits come down, there is no space per se at an aggregate level for a stimulus. There'll be certain segments that can benefit, which is why I think what India needs, and I think that's why the survey is important, is a reform stimulus. I think what the survey is saying is, this is the first year of a third government. We need a reform stimulus. It's when animal spirits increase that you can get some private investment as well.
Important, but of course animal spirits is so ephemeral. You don't know how, the government's been trying to talk up animal spirits with very limited success for a long time. Now, Samiran Chakravarti, when I asked Anant Nageshwar about whether he saw the economic slowdown witnessed in the second quarter of this fiscal as being temporary, cyclical or structural, he said that there'll be a recovery and that this is not structural. Unlike, say, Arvind Subramaniam and several others who are saying that this is structural, he says this is not structural. Now, if it's not structural, the forecast for next year is just 6.3 to 6.8. So if the economy grows at 6.4% this year, and your next year forecast is roughly the same as this year, do you see a contradiction there, that the government says it's not structural, the slowdown, and yet they're not more bullish on how they perceive economic growth to play out next year?
In fact, in the economic survey, there is a chart where it's shown that the last almost 20 years average growth is around that 6.5 to 7% mark. So what we are trying to do today is give a policy nudge to the system so that we get back to that 6.5, 7 type of a growth rate. So this is a very near-term outlook on growth, whereas the other part of the survey is talking about the more medium-term outlook of getting economy back to 8% through all these deregulation, which is the theme of this survey. Now, if you just come to the short-term thing, I guess apart from all these standard arguments about the household balance sheet being impacted because of inflation and relatively low wage growth, there were a couple of additional factors which posed as headwinds. One was that fiscal spending in the first part of the year was very muted. And the other was that credit growth slowed down because of some of the macroprudential measures that RBI had taken and the interest rate tightening. I think both these headwinds are receding now. We have just got the data on government spending for the month of December. There was a 95% year-over-year increase in capex for the month. It looks that the government has stepped up the capex. So with a little bit of lag, this will improve the cash flow in the economy and would become a tailwind for consumption. RBI has already started easing on liquidity front. We hope that we will get to see some rate cut from February onwards. That will also give that nudge. In my view, we don't need a demand side fiscal bazooka at this moment. We need a fiscal nudge. And along with the monetary nudge, we should be able to get back to that 6.5, 7 type of growth. And then if we do the right kind of supply side deregulation, then we would be set for the move towards the 8% mark.
Professor Arun Kumar, Arvind Subramaniam writes recently that the government's policy of promoting national champions or favoring a few companies has had a chilling effect on broader investment, and overzealous taxation, arbitrary application of rules, and weaponizing state agencies has dampened investor enthusiasm. That's his explanation for why private investment hasn't really taken off. The economic survey talks about this in a far more refined, sophisticated language than the bluntness that Arvind Subramaniam demonstrates. But do you see that as being a contributing factor? Sajid Chinoy mentioned a lot of excess supply, manufacturing capacity in China which isn't utilized, and therefore there's no visibility on demand, which is also why India Inc. isn't investing further.
So, there are two components, what is happening in the unorganized sector and what's happening in the organized sector. The organized sector, of course, is affected by cronyism, because what cronyism does is it increases the risk for non-cronies. That's why you have large number of, high net worth individuals leaving the country. They don't see India as a very good destination for investment. That's one contributory reason why investment would not be, private investment would not be buoyant in the organized sector. But in the unorganized sector, investment is declining because demand is shifting from the unorganized sector to the organized sector. And there you have evidence from textile sector, from leather goods sector, you have pressure cooker industry, luggage industry, where what you find is that demand is shifting, and that's why the unorganized sector is declining. So unorganized sector investment is not captured mostly in our macro data, but the unorganized sector investment is also declining. So these are two factors. The third is, in page 328 of the economic survey, it is mentioned that wages have been falling in real terms. Now, if real wages are falling, then of course the demand would be short. So demand becomes an important factor, and added to that, the external sector from where there are a lot of uncertainty that's coming, that uncertainty is not going to be good for investment in India from abroad. That is not going to be good also for Indian private sector investing in India, especially everybody would wait to see what Mr. Trump would do regarding tariffs and what would happen to our exports. And if the rupee falls further, then imported inflation would also rise. That would also create problem for demand within. So in other words, there are many factors, and that's why I think the economic survey needed to have a holistic view. But what the economic survey does is it presents a very rosy view, as if almost everything is taken care of and everything will get taken care of. AI, for instance, the last chapter is very rosy. In India, given the low level of education, look at the Acer reports that come every year, and the level of education, for almost 95% of the students is rather poor. How would AI impact them? And now AI is going to impact even mental jobs. Not just physical labor would be displaced, but even mental labor is going to be displaced by AI. So therefore, we face a huge problem of unemployment in coming days. Some people may get jobs in the AI sector and the IT sector, but otherwise, I think the impact would be very large on many, many sectors.
Pranjal Bhandari, one is the outlook of citizens, the other is the outlook of Indian investors when it comes to investing in the Indian economy. The last piece is about foreign investors. Now, we've seen net FDI was just 0.8% in the first half of this year. Now, that's quite alarming that, there's a lot of repatriation happening for various reasons. And foreign portfolio investment has also been net negative. Now, do you see that change? What are the cues that you think foreign investors are looking out for in this budget to make them want to come and invest more, whether it's through direct investment or portfolio investment in the India story?
Yeah. So just a couple of years ago, the FDI inflows into India had really gone up. You were getting $40 billion in high-tech sectors. And then after that, it just suddenly dried up. I think what happened was a lot of this money went to other advanced economies who were able to give bigger subsidies than we were able to give. So high-tech FDI didn't stay, it went away. And then we are left with mid-tech FDI. I keep saying this high-tech versus mid-tech because it's so important. Mid-tech FDI was just very weak always in India. We just somehow never really saw it go up. And I think that's our biggest challenge. How should we get mid-tech FDI to go up? How will it go up? I think it'll go up if, we can dare to be different. In a world where everybody is getting protectionist, if we can actually say, no, we are open for business. We keep our import tariffs low. We keep our exchange rate flexible, and we go out there and we sign FTAs with countries like the United States of America, I think these are great ways in which we can show we're open for business. We can plug into a lot of the supply chains, and we can actually get manufacturing in mid-tech sectors, and we can get jobs, and we can get growth and consumption and everything else that people were speaking about. One last point here, we're all told, how can India produce in a world where there's so much of Chinese excess capacity? Now, if you look at it carefully, there is a lot of Chinese excess capacities, but not in every sector. For example, if you look at automobiles or electronics, there's a lot of Chinese excess capacity. But in many of the consumer sectors, the mid-tech sectors, there's not that much excess capacity. And I think India can play a role if it's able to deregulate. I'll take 10 seconds more and just bring in one point which hasn't been brought up yet. The CEA spoke about deregulation across the states of India. It's just not a document for the central government. And I completely agree. For us, the big challenge is that we want some of our slow-growing states, which we have historically called the Bimaru states, to start growing more rapidly. Because if we can do that, we can see very high clips of growth for a long period of time. And I think that's the big challenge. How can you get some of these states, which we call the Bimaru states, to deregulate and grow a lot? And here I'm going to end with something positive that I'm seeing in the last 5 years or so. Many of these slow-growing states have actually caught up in terms of growth rate, and simply because their governments are doing a lot more of their deregulation and capex, spending on roads, on rails, on infrastructure. And if we can actually continue on that and get some of our UPs to rise, then I think we can, get good growth.
We've heard different prescriptive measures. It's most important now to see the extent to which the finance minister and the prime minister are listening to what these economists and his own chief economic advisor are saying. And the good thing that I can pick up from this conversation is that some of the worst in terms of inflation may potentially be behind us, and therefore as monetary policy eases and depending on what the finance minister does, growth going forward may be better than it's been in the past couple of quarters. I want to thank all our guests for joining us.